The morning air was thick with tension as the announcement echoed through the high-rise office of King Enterprises. Alexander King, a man known for his iron will and ruthless ambition, stood motionless. A deep silence enveloped the room as the broadcast continued. News of the scandal, the one he never saw coming, cut deeper than any rival's attack. His grip on the company was slipping. The walls seemed to close in around him, as faces turned pale and whispers of betrayal began to flood the once harmonious halls. Alexander had been invincible, the pinnacle of corporate power, but now his empire was crumbling under the weight of a single revelation. His trusted allies were no longer loyal, and the vultures began to circle, smelling blood in the water. The headlines were already plastering his name in bold, each word a blow to his legacy. The trust he had worked so hard to cultivate shattered in an instant. And the worst part? He was alone, left with only the remnants of a reputation that had once been untouchable. The silence in the room was suffocating. The words "King Enterprises is under investigation" echoed in Alexander's mind, the impact of the scandal slowly sinking in. His empire, built on decades of meticulous planning, was unraveling in front of him. Rachel Daniels stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mix of sympathy and fear. She knew the cost of ambition, but she never imagined it would come to this. "Alexander, we need to do something," she whispered, her voice tight. He turned to face her, his anger now mixing with a sense of urgency. He had always been able to control the narrative, to bend the world to his will. But this was different. The walls were closing in, and no matter how hard he fought, the ground beneath him was crumbling. Trust, once his most valuable asset, was now slipping away. As the executives began to murmur in hushed tones, Alexander realized the true depth of the betrayal surrounding him. The people he had trusted most were now the very ones plotting his downfall. The room buzzed with anxiety, each executive's eyes darting from one another, whispering in hushed tones. Alexander's pulse quickened as the weight of the situation sank deeper into his chest. His empire, his legacy, was now in jeopardy. Jonas Everly, ever the opportunist, saw the moment as his chance. "This could be the end of King Enterprises," Jonas said, his voice oozing with feigned sympathy. Alexander shot him a cold, piercing look. Jonas's smile was thin and calculating. He wasn't here to help, but to take what was left. The battle for control had already begun. Behind him, Rachel Daniels whispered urgently, "We need to act fast, or they'll pick us apart." Alexander's eyes flickered to the faces of those in the room. Some uncertain, others resolute. His hands gripped the table, and for the first time he saw the doubt in the eyes of the very people who had once sworn loyalty to him. The stakes had never been higher, and yet, in that moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was already slipping beyond his grasp. His decisions from this point forward would either restore his power or hasten his downfall. Alexander couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. He needed to make a move. The quiet hum of the room felt suffocating, and the murmurs grew louder with each passing second. Robert Hughes, the CFO, spoke up, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "We need a plan. The investors will start pulling out if they think we're sinking." His words hit hard. The idea of losing control over the board was his greatest fear. Rachel Daniels leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can still save this, but we need to move quickly." Alexander nodded, his mind already racing through the possible moves. Every second mattered. But then, an unexpected voice spoke. Emily Foster, the company's head legal counsel, had remained silent until now. "We can't just fight this with brute force, Alexander. If this scandal breaks wide open, you're not just losing investors, you're losing your credibility." Her words were harsh, but they were true. Alexander felt a chill at the thought of losing everything he had built. But even in the face of his deepest fear, he knew one thing: he wouldn't go down without a fight. The room felt like it was spinning. Alexander's mind raced as each new revelation weighed heavier on his shoulders. The financial reports, the potential investigations, everything was falling apart. He looked at Rachel Daniels, who had been by his side through thick and thin, but even her unwavering loyalty was beginning to waver. Jonas Everly was already making his move, and Alexander knew it. The pieces were all aligning for a hostile takeover. As the weight of his empire seemed to slip away, he couldn't help but feel a surge of anger and frustration. "They think they can take me down that easily," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else in the room. Rachel Daniels met his gaze, her voice steady but laced with concern. "They might not take you down, but you can't take them all on alone, Alexander. We need help." The words hung in the air, and Alexander's pulse quickened. The battle for his company and his legacy had just begun. But at what cost would this fight come? The tension in the room was palpable. Every executive's eyes seemed to bore into Alexander King. But he could feel the shift, an undercurrent of betrayal weaving through the corporate landscape. Jonas Everly had begun his move, publicly positioning himself as the company's savior. He was everywhere, in the media, in boardrooms, making backroom deals. His words were sugar-coated, but the taste of manipulation was bitter. "You know, Alexander," Jonas had said to him in their last confrontation, "this company could be something truly great again, but only if it's under new leadership." Alexander fought to maintain control of his expression, the rage inside barely contained. He had built this company, fought tooth and nail to get here. And now Jonas was trying to dismantle everything he had worked for. His empire, his legacy, his pride, they were all on the line. Rachel Daniels, standing beside him, glanced at the clock. "The investors will start pulling out soon if we don't act fast." Alexander's fingers drummed on the table as he looked over at Robert Hughes, the CFO, whose worried expression told him everything he needed to know. The walls were closing in. The stakes were rising by the hour. Jonas Everly had been positioning himself as the new face of stability, reaching out to key shareholders and investors. Alexander knew it was a matter of time before Jonas orchestrated a full coup. But what hurt most wasn't the business tactics, it was the personal betrayal. Jonas had been a mentor to Alexander once, guiding him through the early days of King Enterprises. Now, he was the one trying to tear it all down. But Jonas wasn't the only one Alexander had to worry about. Robert Hughes, his CFO, had grown increasingly distant, his loyalty now in question. "We might have to make some hard decisions, Alexander," Robert said one morning, his voice low. The ambiguity in his words was more telling than anything else. In the back of Alexander's mind, doubt crept in like a slow poison. Was Robert playing both sides? As the day wore on, the intensity of the situation didn't lessen. Each decision Alexander made seemed to drive a deeper wedge between him and the people he trusted most. The betrayal felt like a slow, deliberate cut. Alexander had always trusted Rachel Daniels, but even she seemed to be stepping back. In their quiet moments, she had expressed doubts, had whispered about the overwhelming pressure from investors. "Alexander," she had said, her voice strained, "people are already writing you off. I'm just trying to protect you." The words stung, but they were laced with truth. As the pressure mounted, Alexander found himself retreating into his office, away from prying eyes. It wasn't just his company at risk, it was his reputation, his very identity. The walls of the office towered over him, trapping him in his thoughts. Every move had to be calculated. But how much longer could he keep playing this game? With each passing day, the threats grew more tangible, more immediate. Jonas Everly's smirk was constantly in his mind, a reminder of what was at stake. And then there was the financial collapse, potentially months of litigation, potential criminal charges. Everything was coming to a head. Alexander's body clenched in frustration. The battle was far from over. In a moment of desperation, Alexander reached out to Emily Foster, the company's legal counsel, hoping she would back him in the impending battle. She had always been fiercely loyal, and he needed her now more than ever. "I've looked over the contracts," Emily said, pacing in front of Alexander's desk. "We're exposed, Alexander. The leaks are going to hit soon, and if we don't control the narrative, we'll lose everything." The walls felt like they were closing in even tighter. His reputation, already tainted by the scandal, was on the brink of collapse. Emily's warnings felt like daggers, but he had no choice but to listen. There was no time to waste. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Alexander had always been able to manipulate the board, the press, even his closest allies. But now, it was all slipping from his grasp. Even Rachel Daniels was starting to waver, her trust in him thinning. Every corner he turned, more and more enemies emerged, and fewer allies remained. The hour of reckoning was upon him. Alexander was running out of time. The board was growing restless, the investors were nervous, and Jonas' machinations were beginning to show. "We're going to lose everything if you don't act now," Rachel Daniels had warned. But Alexander could feel the pressure mounting, every decision carrying the weight of the world. He needed to act fast, but every move seemed more risky than the last. Jonas Everly's influence was spreading like a virus, infiltrating every corner of the company. As Alexander prepared to meet with the board, he realized the true cost of ambition. His decisions had led him to this precipice, and now he had to either leap forward into a final gambit or lose everything. But even as he set the stage for what could be a decisive battle, a creeping sense of doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Was this fight worth it? Or was he too far gone? The conference room was a battlefield. Alexander King sat at the head of the table, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished wood, a signal of his deep concentration. Across from him, the board members were restless, whispering among themselves. Jonas Everly, ever the manipulator, had seized the moment, positioning himself as the solution to the crisis Alexander had created. "We need change, Alexander," Jonas had said during the meeting, his voice smooth and convincing. "I can stabilize this company, turn it around, but you need to step down." The suggestion hung in the air, thick with the weight of betrayal. Rachel Daniels, his closest ally, shifted uncomfortably beside him. "We don't have the luxury of time, Alexander," she whispered, her words barely audible over the low murmur of the room. He could feel the pressure mounting with each passing second, each pair of eyes on him, judging his every move. The walls seemed to close in, and the room grew colder. He had built everything on his vision, his relentless drive, his ambition. But now, that vision was crumbling. "If you step down now," Jonas continued, "we can salvage what's left." But Alexander wasn't ready to surrender yet. His empire, his legacy, it was all at stake. He stood tall, even as his heart pounded in his chest. This battle was far from over. The tension in the room thickened. Alexander King could feel the eyes of the room burning into him, their judgment palpable. The weight of his decisions had never felt so heavy. Robert Hughes, the CFO, who had once been his closest ally, now spoke up. "You don't have a choice, Alexander. This is bigger than you." His voice was steady, but betrayed an underlying tone of disappointment. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Was Robert truly lost to him, or was he just another pawn in Jonas' game? He could see the cracks in the walls now, the ones he had ignored in the rush of ambition. Rachel Daniels, always the voice of reason, leaned in, her eyes flicking toward the clock. "We don't have the luxury of time, Alexander. The board's ready to make a decision." The words hit like a slap. He had been so focused on the fight ahead that he hadn't seen the cracks growing beneath him. It was all slipping away. "You have 1 hour," Robert continued, his voice clipped. "Make your move." The finality of the words cut deep. Jonas Everly stood in the background, a silent observer, his smile barely concealed. He had already won. Or so it seemed. Outside the boardroom, the storm was growing. Jonas Everly's machinations had pushed Alexander to the edge, but he was still fighting. As the meeting dragged on, Alexander found himself alone in the hallway with Emily Foster, the legal counsel. She had been quiet until now, her eyes betraying the weight of what was about to happen. "You can't keep this up, Alexander," she said softly, her voice filled with concern. "The board is already divided, and the investors are backing Jonas. You need to make a choice." Alexander felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Was she right? Had he already lost control? He had always believed that the fight was worth it, that his ambition justified the sacrifices. But now, with everything slipping away, he wasn't so sure. Emily's gaze softened as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not here to betray you, Alexander, but you need to see the bigger picture. You can't win this battle without losing yourself." The weight of her words settled heavily in his chest. Could he win this fight and still hold on to his soul? Or was this the cost of ambition? Back in the boardroom, the clock was ticking. Alexander had made his decision, but the room was filled with doubt. Jonas Everly, standing at the far end of the table, was watching him closely, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know what's best, Alexander," Jonas said, his tone condescending. "Let me help you before you destroy everything." The offer felt like a knife to the chest. He had been so sure of his own path, so confident that his vision would carry him through. But now, faced with the collapse of his empire and the weight of his choices, Alexander found himself questioning everything. Rachel Daniels was still standing beside him, her face unreadable. "This isn't just about the company anymore," she whispered. "This is about your legacy. Do you want to be remembered as the man who lost everything, or the one who walked away with what little dignity he had left?" Her words were the final push. Alexander knew that the decision he made now would define him, for better or worse. The final decision was made. Alexander King had chosen his course, but it was a bitter pill to swallow. The room was silent as he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "I'm not stepping down," he said, each word carrying the weight of the fight ahead. "But I will fight this my way." Jonas Everly leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Then the battle begins, Alexander. Let's see who wins." The tension was unbearable as the board members exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for the fallout. Alexander knew this wouldn't be easy. There would be sacrifices, more betrayals, and more backroom deals. But he had no choice. The battle for his empire, his legacy, had only just begun. As he walked out of the room, Rachel Daniels followed him, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You've made your move," she said. "Now we see if it's enough." Alexander looked at her, his eyes hardening. "It will be. It has to be." The tide was turning, and Alexander King could feel it with every step he took. The room was colder now, the walls closing in around him. Jonas Everly had made his first move in the battle for control, but Alexander wasn't about to let him take everything without a fight. His grip on the company had weakened, but he was still in the game. Rachel Daniels had tried to warn him, but now, with the clock ticking and the board members growing restless, he had no choice but to take a bold step. The board meeting had barely started, and already whispers of Jonas' influence were spreading through the room like wildfire. Robert Hughes, the CFO, stood at the front, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "We need to stabilize the company," Robert said, his voice low, but his words clear. "If we don't act now, we could lose everything." Alexander's eyes narrowed. He knew this was more than just business. This was about survival. The company was no longer just a place of work. It was the battleground for his soul. Jonas Everly's words echoed in his mind. "If you step down now, we can still save this." But Alexander wasn't ready to bow out. Not yet. As the meeting dragged on, Alexander King felt the weight of the decisions pressing down on him. He had always been in control, but now, with Jonas Everly's manipulation seeping through every corner of the company, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. Rachel Daniels stood by his side, her eyes scanning the room, the worry on her face growing with each passing moment. The board members were no longer the loyal allies they once were. They were shifting, their allegiance already swayed by Jonas' quiet promises of a new era. "This is getting out of hand," Rachel whispered, her voice laced with anxiety. Alexander's eyes darkened as he looked around the room. The very people who had once trusted him were now watching him like vultures, waiting for him to slip. Emily Foster, the company's legal counsel, sat near the back, her eyes averted, unwilling to meet his gaze. She knew the truth. She knew the cracks in the foundation. "We need to act now," Jonas Everly said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. If you step down, we can stabilize this company, save it from further damage. But if you don't, the repercussions will be disastrous. The choice felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Alexander clenched his fists under the table, unwilling to let go of the life he had built. Jonas Everly was playing a long game, and Alexander King could see it now. The corporate rival had been working in the shadows, building alliances, positioning himself as the solution to all the company's problems. But what bothered Alexander the most wasn't Jonas' tactics. It was the way Robert Hughes, the CFO, seemed to be drifting further away from him. Robert had always been a trusted ally, but now, his body language spoke volumes. He was no longer on Alexander's side. "We can't continue this way," Robert said, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable tone of finality. "The investors are getting nervous. We need someone with fresh ideas, someone who can clean up the mess you've made." The words stung, but Alexander knew they were true. His empire had been built on ambition, but ambition had a price. As the hours ticked by, he found himself losing not just his grip on the company, but on the very people who had stood by him. Rachel Daniels tried to console him, but even her reassurances felt hollow. "We still have time," she said, but the doubt in her voice was unmistakable. The cracks in his empire were widening, and the floodgates were about to open. The meeting reached its boiling point. Jonas Everly's manipulation was in full swing, and Alexander King could feel the walls closing in. The board members were now fully aligned with Jonas. One by one they began to speak, each offering their support for the rival CEO. "We need a new leader, someone who can take the company into the future," said Emily Foster, the legal counsel, her voice cool and calculating. Alexander's eyes flickered with anger as he realized that even those closest to him had turned. Rachel Daniels, standing beside him, took a deep breath. "It's over, Alexander," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "You've lost." Those words cut deeper than any betrayal. For a moment, Alexander felt a sense of despair wash over him. The company he had built, the empire he had sacrificed so much for, it was all slipping away. But he couldn't show weakness. "Not now. I won't give up this company without a fight," he said, his voice low but filled with resolve. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. The final blow was delivered in the quietest of moments. As Alexander King walked into his office, Rachel Daniels followed him in, her footsteps heavy with regret. She had always been his closest confidant, but even she could no longer ignore the truth. "It's done, Alexander," she said softly. "You've lost the board. Jonas is already making moves behind your back." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Alexander King sat at his desk, his mind spinning. The company was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it. "I'll fight to the end," he muttered, but even he knew the fight was slipping through his fingers. Rachel Daniels stood at the doorway, her face filled with sadness and pity. She knew him too well. This battle had cost him everything. Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of rage and sorrow. "You don't have to stand by me anymore," he said, his voice raw. "But I'm not backing down." Rachel hesitated for a moment before turning and leaving the office, the door closing softly behind her. Alexander sat there alone, the weight of his empire pressing down on him. The news hit like a sledgehammer. Alexander King sat in his office, staring at the glowing screen before him. The headline flashed across his laptop: "King Enterprises facing bankruptcy after scandalous mismanagement." It was happening. Everything he had fought for, everything he had built was slipping away. The financial reports on his desk painted a grim picture. Stock prices plummeting, investors pulling out, creditors circling like vultures. Jonas Everly's strategy had worked. His rival had orchestrated a perfect storm of lies, half-truths, and manipulations, and now Alexander was left with nothing but the wreckage. He had tried to hold on to his legacy, but the damage was too great. Rachel Daniels had tried to warn him, but she had abandoned him long ago, unable to fight alongside a sinking ship. Robert Hughes, too, had made his exit. The company was lost. The air felt thick with defeat, the weight of the years of ambition crushing him. The battle he had waged was over, but it wasn't the end of the fight. There had to be something left, something he could salvage. He wouldn't go down without a last stand, even if it meant losing everything. The clock was ticking, and Jonas was already moving in for the kill. Alexander paced the room, his mind racing with strategies that seemed futile. The walls of his office felt like they were closing in, each step he took echoing his internal struggle. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from Emily Foster, the company's legal counsel. "It's over, Alexander. They've made their move. The board is voting today." He didn't need to read the rest. He had known this was coming, but the finality of it struck him harder than he expected. The realization that everything was slipping through his fingers hit like a physical blow. Jonas Everly's rise to power had been swift and brutal, and now Alexander was watching as his once thriving empire crumbled. Rachel Daniels had left him, Robert Hughes had distanced himself, and even his closest allies were nowhere to be found. The weight of betrayal was suffocating. How had it all come to this? The decisions he had made, the compromises, the sacrifices, had led him to this moment. Alexander knew he couldn't win, but the question remained. Was he willing to go down without a fight? With everything on the line, one last gamble might be his only option. The final meeting was called. The board had made its decision, and Jonas Everly was poised to take over. Alexander King walked into the boardroom, his shoulders squared, his jaw set. He wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. But as he entered the room, he could see it in their eyes. The board had already made up their minds. Jonas Everly stood at the front, a smug expression on his face. "It's over, Alexander," Jonas said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You've lost. The board has voted, and I am now the CEO of King Enterprises." The words felt like daggers, each one piercing deeper into Alexander's resolve. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment he considered storming out, refusing to accept the verdict. But there was no escape. "You think you've won," Alexander said, his voice calm but filled with fury. "But this company was built on more than just power. It was built on vision. Vision that you'll never understand." The tension in the room was palpable, but Alexander wasn't backing down. Rachel Daniels, once his most trusted ally, sat quietly at the table, her eyes filled with pity. She had already made her decision, and now Alexander was forced to make his. After the board meeting, Jonas Everly's victory felt hollow to Alexander. He walked back to his office, the weight of the loss settling in. His empire was gone. Rachel Daniels had already left, her parting words still echoing in his ears. "I tried to warn you, Alexander, but you wouldn't listen." The hallway was empty, the only sound the faint click of his shoes against the marble floor. As he reached his office, he paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle. The world outside had moved on, but Alexander's world had collapsed. He opened the door, stepping inside. The office felt emptier now, as though it were no longer his. He had spent so many years building this empire, and now it was gone. His achievements felt like distant memories. Jonas Everly would take over, and Alexander would be left to watch from the sidelines. "I should have known," Alexander muttered to himself, sinking into the chair behind his desk. The moment was bitter, and yet a strange sense of peace washed over him. He had fought until the very end. That at least was his victory. Alexander King walked away from his empire, not with the triumph he had once imagined, but with a heavy heart and a sense of finality. The decision had been made. Jonas Everly was now the CEO, and the company he had built was no longer his. Alexander had given everything for this moment, for this empire, but it had come at a cost he hadn't fully realized until now. Rachel Daniels was gone. Robert Hughes had walked away. The people he trusted had all turned their backs on him. As he left the building for the last time, the cold night air hit him like a slap. The city seemed indifferent to his fall from grace, the lights of the skyline twinkling in the distance, as though mocking his defeat. He had gambled everything, and in the end, he had lost. But Alexander wasn't one to surrender easily. As he walked away from the shattered remnants of his empire, he knew one thing. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. He would rebuild. He had to. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new. Alexander King sat in his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline, the weight of failure pressing down on him. His empire was gone, and with it, his legacy. The anger had faded, replaced by a deep, aching emptiness. The silence in his apartment felt suffocating. He had nothing left, but his thoughts were clearer than ever. His ambition had cost him everything. Even his closest allies, like Rachel Daniels, had turned away. It was over. His empire crumbled under the weight of his choices. The phone call was brief. Jonas Everly's victory was complete, and Robert Hughes confirmed it. "It's too late, Alexander. There's no turning back." Each word struck deeper than the last. The betrayal was complete. Alexander's heart raced, but the anger had dissipated. Now, it was only regret. Had it been worth it? The answer was no. His ambition, once a source of pride, was now his downfall. As he stared at the phone in his hand, the realization hit. Everything had been a lie. Even his own convictions. The echoes of the past haunted him. Rachel Daniels had warned him, but he hadn't listened. She was right. Everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. He walked into his office for the last time, a place that once symbolized power. The walls now felt like they were closing in. His reflection in the glass seemed foreign. The reality was unbearable. He had sacrificed so much, but at what cost? The people who had once supported him were gone, and Alexander was left to confront his own demons. In the quiet of the night, Alexander King walked alone through the streets. His suit was wrinkled, and his face, once filled with determination, now showed only weariness. The city around him moved in fast forward, indifferent to his fall. He had nothing left to hold on to. His empire, his legacy, all gone. The only thing left was the bitter taste of ambition, and the haunting realization that he had lost himself in the pursuit of power. The world would keep spinning, and he would be forgotten. The weight of ambition had finally broken him. Alexander sat alone, reflecting on everything he had lost. The cost was too high. He had alienated everyone who cared for him, and in the end, he was left with nothing. The city outside his window was a reminder of the life he had once lived, full of promises and ambition. But now those dreams felt distant and hollow. Could he rebuild? Or had he destroyed it all beyond repair? The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He couldn't go back. The final vote had been cast. Alexander King, mid-40s, stood before the board once more. The room felt colder than ever, and the weight of defeat crushed him. Jonas Everly, now the new CEO, stood with a victorious smile. "It's over, Alexander," Jonas said. Alexander had lost it all. His empire was shattered. He looked around the room. Everyone, once his allies, now turned against him. But he would walk out with his head held high, for he knew that nothing in this world was forever. Victor Grant, the shadow investor, had made his move, and the company was now beyond repair. Alexander walked through the empty halls of the once bustling building. The silence was suffocating. Every corner reminded him of his fall from grace. Jonas Everly would run things now, but Alexander was left with nothing. "I had everything," he whispered, a bitter smile forming. "And I lost it all." His empire, his dreams, all shattered by greed and ambition. The world would continue, but Alexander had been forgotten. Outside, Alexander King stood in the rain, staring at the looming skyline. The city that once symbolized his triumphs now felt distant, indifferent. He had burned bridges, alienated everyone who once stood by him, and lost the very thing that had given his life meaning, his legacy. The storm mirrored the turmoil inside him. What now? He asked himself. There was no going back, only forward, into an uncertain future. But the question lingered, was it too late to rebuild? As Rachel Daniels left the building for the final time, she paused. Her eyes met Alexander's across the street, filled with a mixture of pity and sadness. "You could have had it all, Alexander," she said, her voice quiet. "But you pushed everyone away." The weight of her words hit harder than any business deal ever could. He had sacrificed everything, his empire, his friendships, his future, all for ambition. And now, all he had was a hollow victory over nothing. In the final moments, Alexander King stood alone on the rooftop, looking out at the city below. The quiet hum of the world, moving forward, felt like a cruel reminder of what he had lost. He had built an empire on ambition, but now, all that remained were memories of what could have been. The city was still alive, still thriving, but Alexander was a shadow, forgotten and left behind. He wasn't sure if he could rebuild. But as the night wore on, a small spark of hope remained. Maybe, just maybe, he could start again.